There. The next thing that we see in his life is the ability to assume authority. Now we know that God came to him and gave him a task. And what was Moses' first reaction? Hey, I can't do this. They don't know who I am. How are they going to believe me? And that type of thing. So as a leader, yes, we should know what our limitations are. I can't speak. That type of thing. So we always want to back off with God and say, well, I can't teach that class, or, I can't lead that group, or I can't witness to that person. I don't have the things to say. But you know what? God does. God does. And he wants to use us in many different ways. And how did he use Moses? Well, brother Aaron came along. And he was able to speak through Aaron. He also gave Moses the ability to have a staff, in his hand, that this staff did mighty things and showed mighty things before the people. But the point that I want to make here is that when we are given a task and God gives us authority, sometimes that authority goes to our head. And we've got to be very careful. Did it go to Moses' head? Did he lord it over the people then and say, hey, I'm in charge, you guys bow down? No. If you look in that same passage there, in verse 3 of chapter 12, it says, now the man Moses was very humble. Listen to this. More than any man who was on the face of the earth. What a great thing. God can give you a task. He can give you the authority. And then he calls you humble. That is a wonderful thing. But in leadership, we've got to realize that sometimes we're given great authority. And in the Marines, sometimes I was given great authority. But you know what? You can't let that go to your head. You can't say, well, now I'm in charge and everybody, do what I say, because I'm great. No. You've got to be on your knees before the Lord. And that's where Moses was. He was on his knees before the Lord as a leader, as a hero right there. So you know that he's grasping onto God's power, his strength in doing these tasks. So it's a very important thing. Now, you see that when you have that authority, you also have to handle failure. Because the people underneath you are going to fail. Now, what are you going to do? Say, hey, those bad people underneath me, they failed, they're bad, kill them. No. Moses went before the Lord and represented the people before the Lord many times and cried out to the Lord that he spare them. I'm thinking of one instance where Aaron and Miriam, brother and sister, come to Moses and say, hey, look, we've got some things to say too around here. And we don't like the way you've been conducting yourself. And we don't like the way you married this Cushite woman and all that. Wow, a little insurrection within the family right there. But they challenged his authority. And you know what? God came out in this passage in Numbers 12 and said, no, Moses is my man. And we all know that Miriam suffered leprosy because of that. She was kind of the instigator, I think, in that issue. But you have to see that you and I, as leaders, what can we learn from Moses is that he was able to handle this authority, and he knew what the base of that authority was, and he knew how to go back to that God of his and say, I need help. And he was prostrate before God saying, I need that help. I need that assistance. So where was this source of this hero? In his God, right there. And it's such a fantastic thing to be able to talk to that. And he represented the people. One other thing, and I noted from Exodus 15, is that Moses knew how to handle success. What did he do after they crossed the Nile? The Red Sea, I should say. What did he do? He sang. It's a beautiful passage in Exodus chapter 15 where Moses sings this wonderful song and just really pours his heart out to God. So where does our success come from? It comes from God, right there. So as a hero, we trust him. It's so easy to stand up and say, wow, look what I did. Look how great I was in this process. No. We have to thank God. We have to see what our power and our source is from him. Now, the other thing that Moses did, that I'll go to point 4 there, is he was able to delegate. And that didn't happen right off the bat. We read in Exodus chapter 18 that Moses was trying to be the judge of everybody, represent everybody, and do it all himself. And there was probably a line of 600 people out there every day looking for judgments on grieves that they had with their neighbor, or they'd done things wrong and they were brought before the court. So Moses had to learn to delegate. And this happened twice. Another instance where he came before the Lord in Numbers chapter 11, and he said, hey, I'm holding all the burden of the people on me. You know, I did this, I did that. Boy, he was having a real pity party out there with God. It's all me. Well, what did God do? God said, call out faithful men, delegate responsibilities, and they'll share the burden with you. And that is an important thing behind the leadership. You are going to be given a task, but does God expect you to do everything in that task? As a leader, he expects us to delegate. And you can't delegate unless you have discerning capabilities of character. You have to be able to look out and choose the right men around you, the right women around you that are going to lead in those various aspects of that task that God gives you. So these are important principles to share the vision, the responsibility, and the judgments that have to take place within God's plan. And then to be able to share the load. You know, how many people do you have praying with you right now on the tasks that God has given you? How many in here teach classes, teach Bible studies, or teach home Bible studies, or that type of thing? How many of you have a prayer support group that lifts you up each week and says, hey, we're praying for you? You know, how many of you are witnessing? We're all witnessing for Christ. Do we have people around us that are praying for us that will make us an effective witness out there? You know, it's so important that we have that prayer and be able to share that load. The final thing that I want to hit is accountability. You know, this is one area that, as I looked at Moses' life, he was accountable to God. You know, yes, we're accountable to God. And when we fail, we go to our God and we admit our failure, and we confess, and we move through that. But you know, there's two other aspects of this accountability that I want to stress as far as leadership goes. Is the accountability that Moses placed with Jethro, the priest of Midian. And if you want a great Bible study, look at Exodus chapter 18, where Jethro comes out to Moses. And you can see this wonderful relationship as Moses comes out to him and bows down to him and kisses his feet, basically, and then shares the mighty gifts and the mighty deliverance of God, and they rejoice together. But then the next thing you see is Jethro correcting Moses and rebuking him, basically, saying, hey, Moses, look you're doing some things wrong here. Wow, what did Moses do? Now, you can't tell me. You're just a lowly priest from Midian. No, he took it on. And he said, you're right. I mean, this man is humble. He's in charge of millions of people out there, and yet he's taking criticism. And that's what we have to do as leaders. We have to be able to take criticism. We're accountable to God. We're accountable to our mentor. And in this case, Jethro was Moses' mentor. And it probably lasted over a 40-year period, and we see some of the fruit of it in this process. But at the same time, Moses mentored someone. Who was that? Joshua. And you see from Numbers chapter 11, verse 28, that Moses took on Joshua at a young age. And he said that he was his handservant from young. And then we see later on Joshua being the commander and leading the troops into battle. And then we see Moses turning over the authority and the power as God directed to Joshua. So we can see, we don't have a lot of verses on it, but we can see this wonderful process of God using this mighty man to translate what he had and what God's vision and task was to a younger man, and then see that torch being handed off to Joshua. And then we all know history, and we know the book of Joshua, how this mighty man of God was able to just do wonderful things out there. Was he perfect? No. Now, he failed too in some areas. But the great thing is that in leadership, there is accountability. And we see some leaders today that are failing because they don't have anybody to go to. They don't have an older mentor that they can talk to and pour their heart out to. They don't have a younger person that they can be accountable for. You know, it's nice to, I had lieutenants working for me, and I was able to counsel them and say, hey, your marriage, is messed up. I usually turn my collar inside out. I'm here to counsel with you. God has a plan for marriage, and you're messing it up. Well, what happens if my marriage goes on the rocks? So I'm accountable out there to live that perfect example, or attempt to live that perfect example before them. Okay? So it's important. I would like to close with the commendation of Moses. Look over at Hebrews chapter 11. And you know, this is such a tremendous thing. If you want to have the topic of hero, and you want to hit, there's so many points on Moses, and I thank you for allowing me this short amount of time to talk about him. But look at the life here. In verse 24, chapter 11. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He had it all. Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world, he had it all. He refused to be called that. Why? Because he knew the spiritual heritage that he was entrusted with by his parents and by his upbringing. Choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God. You know, that is the greatest thing of leadership right there, to be able to identify and to associate and to be able to lower down. Now, it's important here that we see in Hebrews, we see God's view. Yeah, you can go and study the other ones and say, well, he killed a guy, or he failed in this area. But it's important to see that God, in the book of Hebrews, is able to show the great and mighty things that Moses did. And then he says, not fearing the wrath of the king. You know, when your heart is focused on the objective, and you know God's word, and you have built those relationship with the attributes of God, where is fear? Fear starts to, it still might be there, but it starts to be replaced by that mighty trust that we have. So Moses could go to Egypt before Pharaoh. So he could face enemies out in the wilderness. So he could face the no water situations. So he could face the no food situation. And he could look at those and say, God is leading us to that objective, and I believe that he can do it. And the people followed. Okay? The people also rebelled too at times, and it was scary for him. But I'll close with this point. Numbers chapter 12, he is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth. Well, I tell you what, not too many humans can brag or boast of that in the history of mankind. That God was able to use this man, this mighty hero. And I would ask you, just in review, that you will look at Moses and be able to see these principles in your life. That you will be able to assume a task that God gives you. That you will be able to grow in knowledge and be able to use that knowledge in the task. That you'll be able to use the authority that God gives you properly. That you will not abuse it in any way. That you'll be able to delegate responsibility to gifted men and women that God puts underneath you. That you will use them as gifted, ones that God has given you, and you love them for that. You know, it's just like me with my Marines. I love those guys, and I do anything I can to take care of them, just as a parent would a child. And then finally, that you will be accountable to God. That you will realize the position that God puts you in, and that you will see the high and mighty goals and responsibilities that position holds, and that you will turn those over to men and women that are under you in mentoring. Okay, so I would like to close with that, and I just thank you for your time, and I'll be glad to try to answer any questions later on, but thank you.
As the colonel sits down, can you join with me in, first of all, stand to your feet and saying, Colonel Bryan, thank you, sir. 1, 2, 3. Colonel Bryan, thank you, sir. You may be seated. I'm reminded of a statement made by Mark Twain. He said, I really apologize for sending you such a long letter. I didn't have enough time to make it shorter. It's hard to get something like this into 15 or 20 minutes. We're going to ask John to come up, and I don't want to steal any of his time. John Selkin, he's going to talk about 2 men, not one, but all in somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 17 minutes, something like that, maybe 20. John, investment advisor from Milwaukee. We're privileged to have him here. Give a hand and a warm welcome to John.
Thank you, man. It's really great to be back with you. This morning, in an attempt to give you materials to take home for your family and for your own implementation, I'm going to waive the temptation to be dramatic and to be a public speaker. Instead, I probably will be like a boring lecturer, except for one fact. The topic is so exciting it'll light you up like a tungsten filament. In profiling this exemplary hero, I feel a great deal like Abraham Lincoln as he approached Gettysburg for his famous address, realizing that it was beyond his poor power to add or to detract. That's the circumstance this morning in profiling the life and character of Robert E. Lee. My friends, my brothers, I saw more Christ-likeness in the life of this warrior than I have ever seen in a minister, a pastor, a missionary, up to this date. And that is the fundamental thing to remember. That's the preface to my remarks. We must look at Robert E. Lee as the consummate Christian gentleman. Now, if you want to have the same experience, uplifting experience that I had in preparing this briefing, I would commend to you this little book, which is mentioned in my outline. It is called Call of Duty, The Sterling Nobility of Robert E. Lee by Stephen Wilkins. I would say to my friend Bob Vernon, how often do we hear the word nobility applied to a human being in this life? Modern Americans of our age, whether we be old fossils like me or younger men like Jeremy and Garrett, we know little about the history of heroes in America's past. I suggest to you that is not accidental. That America is being submerged into a one-world globalist government which will not recognize national heroes. But of your youth, a few might know that Robert E. Lee wore gray in the Civil War. Some may know that he is the commander of the Confederate Army, surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, the courthouse, in 1865. But fewer still would know that Lee's father, the famed Light Horse Harry Lee, was a much decorated, dashing young military hero of our war for independence, and that he was a close and intimate friend of George Washington. Or that Robert E. Lee's father, Henry Lee, was a three-time governor of the state of Virginia. Or that Lee's mother, Anne Carter Lee, was Martha Washington's great-granddaughter. Or that young Robert was to become a legendary cadet at West Point, standing number one in both tactics and artillery, number two academically in the class, and has the all-time good conduct record at West Point, never suffering a single demerit in his 4-year career at the U.S. Military Academy. I know men who accepted appointments to service academies hoping they could equal the conduct record of the great Robert E. Lee. But there, Robert E. Lee learned additional things about self-discipline. He was a believer in the idea that success is not always dependent upon utter perfection. Sometimes success comes to the one who simply makes fewer mistakes than the other fellow. Consoling, isn't it? I think that's something that we can take home to our sons and daughters. We're not going to achieve utter perfection, but consistency is the key. But I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. The best way to assess the life of Robert E. Lee, I believe, is to look at the end of it. It was a tragic life and a glorious life all in one. To look at the end of it and then go back to see the formative process by which the Lord molded this magnificent model of Christian manhood. The parallels with what Brian said will be gripping. The British literary giant Samuel Johnson once said that any man honored by both his enemies and his compatriots is a man worthy of our closest attention, for in him you may be sure to find authenticity. After all, authenticity is the rarest of all human traits. We knew that already from the good book, didn't we? In Proverbs 16, we learn, when a man's ways are pleasing to the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. The dynamic Christian journalist George Grant, you might want to underscore that name. Read George Grant. He said this of Robert E. Lee: a little over a century ago,